Peace, peace, peace. We back. And welcome again to Rational Lens Podcast. You understand? This is what we're doing now. Rational Lens Podcast. And once I start doing the podcasts, and I'm still going to do my lives on Facebook, everything going to come together. But for now, this is what we're calling it. Rational Lens Podcast. And like I said, it's a new thing that's going to be popping. So, before I left, we was talking about the indigenous people and the Anglo-American culture and how it meshed together when these Anglo-Saxons came over here from Europe. And remember, I was telling you, they were your elite Moors that came from the European black nobility. You understand? These were your black conquerors that came over here and took land and resource from the Aboriginal indigenous people that were already over here. You understand? And we was talking about the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee, and the Seminoles, and how they merged together with your Anglo-American culture. And during the 19th and 18th century, when they came over here, your elite Moors who set up the United States Corporation. And remember, there were 2 United States. One, the United States of America under the Constitution was a corporation, and the other one who started the original organic Constitution that was under the Article of Confederation. You understand? Continental Congress. And the original organic United States was more organic, and they were based on what we'll call on protecting divine rights. You understand? Inalienable rights. We should say that civilization was based on protecting people inalienable rights that were given to them by God. You understand? And then George Washington and them came and they created a new constitution under a federal republic, you understand, that was being ruled by a central banking system called the Federal Reserve. You understand? And this was more of a military commerce, what I call admiralty law, corporate construct that they put us under. You understand? So let me let's talk about first. I wrote some notes, right? So first we want to talk about the black conquerors, and I want to talk about the elite Moors that came over here from Europe. You understand? And they took land and resource from the indigenous people and enslaved them, right? So I hope y'all know that most of your conquistadors or your conquerors that came over here were dark-skinned people. Later on, they became Caucasians. But the first conquistadors to come over here and enslave the indigenous people and take land and resource from them was dark-skinned Moors or your elite Moors. So the first thing I want to go to page 173, and there's a book called Black Conquistadors. You understand? And we're going to read from that. So when we talk about the black conquistadors, we're talking about the black conquerors, your Anglo-Americans that came from Europe, that were under the black nobility bloodline, that came over here, robbed and steal from the indigenous people that were already here. You understand? They were called your black conquistadors. So we're going to go to the book, and y'all can get it, Black Conquistadors. I'm going to tell y'all who wrote it too. But first, let me break this down. Let me put this in. And it says, and this is AI overview, right? It says black conquistadors were men of African descent. Remember I said they were African, they were Moors, and they were the ones that created the black nobility, the European black nobility that was in Europe, way before the Caucasians came into Europe. So what I'm saying to y'all, your Caucasians that y'all calling Europeans, they're not the original Europeans. They're not even from Europe. They're from Central Asia. And they were your Indo-Germans or your Indo-Europeans. So you have your Europeans and you have your Indo-Europeans, those that came from Central Asia and spread it into Europe. And they also spread it into Asia. That's why they were called Indo-Europeans. And then you had your indigenous people of Europe who were dark-skinned, melanated people, big nose, big lips, and woolly hair. These were your elite Moors who eventually created the black nobility or the black European nobility, right? And the word Europe comes from Europa. Europa was the queen of she was the daughter of Agenor, who found Phoenicia, right? And he had a daughter called Europa. And the myth goes that Europa was taken by Zeus. And Zeus took Europa by disguising himself as a white bull. And he enticed Europa to get on top of him, right? And he took her to Europe, or to those islands that we call Europe, right? So check it out. Let me give y'all something and then y'all see what I'm talking about. Right? Because Europe comes from the word Europa, right? And Europa was a black queen, right? It says Europa can refer to Jupiter's icy moon, because Europa is also a satellite when we talk about it astrologically, right? Which likely hosts a subsurface of salt water, oceans, and is a prime candidate for extraterrestrial life. You hear that? Europa can refer to Jupiter's icy moon, which likely hosts a subsurface of salty water, oceans, and is prime candidate for extraterrestrial life. So anywhere where there's water, there can be life. And because Europa is a satellite, a moon, right, that's referred to Jupiter's icy moon, on that satellite, on that moon, is water, right? And it's a prime candidate for extraterrestrial life. You understand? So on that moon that we call Europa, because Europa is a moon, when we talk about it astrologically, there's water there. And anywhere where there's water, there's a possibility of life. And that life will be extraterrestrial because it's outside of Earth. And because it's coming from a satellite called Europa. I hope you understand that. It also says, now we're talking about the Greek mythology. It says the Greek mythology princes loved by Zeus. I told you that. Europa and Zeus fell in love with each other, and Zeus disguised himself as a bull, a white bull. Right? Is it any coincidence that he disguised himself as a white bull, or metamorphosized himself into a white bull to entice Europa to take her away? Right? And they fell in love with each other. So the Greek mythology, princes loved by Zeus, and we know Zeus was the god of the gods, right? It says, give me 1 minute. It says Europa was a Phoenician prince in Greek mythology. Europa was a Phoenician princess loved by Zeus. She was the object of desire for Zeus, the king of the gods, who abducted her. He abducted her, right? So Europa can be a moon that they just explained that has water and life on it, possibility of extraterrestrial life, and Europa is a satellite, right? 1 minute. It says Europa is a strong evidence Jupiter's moon. So Europa is a satellite for Jupiter when we talk about it astrologically, and has a saltwater ocean that may be one of the best places to look for environments where life could exist beyond Earth, right? I want to go into Europa. And then it also says Europa, the mythological Phoenician prince. In Greek mythology, Europa was a Phoenician princess loved by Zeus. She was the object of the desire for Zeus, the king of the gods, who abducted her, right? So who was Europa's father, right? Her father's name was Agenor. And let's see who he was. Give me 1 minute, right? It says Agenor was, in Greek mythology, a Phoenician king of Tyre or Sidon. The Greek historian Herodotus, 484 to 425 BC, born in the city of Halicarnassus under the Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid Empire is a Persian empire. Estimated that Agenor lived either 1,000 or 1,600 years prior to his visit to Tyre in 450 BC at the end of the Greco and Persian War, which took place 499 to 449 BC. He was said to have reigned that city for 63 years, right? And it goes on. The family of Agenor was born in Memphis, Egypt. The key word is Egypt. So if Agenor was born in Memphis, Egypt, we know that Egypt is where melanated people come from, right? And he was the son to Poseidon. Who is Poseidon? Poseidon is the god of the water, right? And we know that the Phoenicians was a powerful admiralty or maritime seafaring, shipbuilding culture who went around conquering land and stealing resource. You understand? And they made these special ships that were made like snakes, right? But their thing was conquering and dominating and robbing and stealing and taking over regional land and putting it under their empire. This is what the Phoenicians were about. You understand? Agenor was born in Memphis, Egypt. So they had to be dark-skinned. And he was the son to Poseidon, who was the god of water, who was the brother of Zeus, who stole Europe or Europa and fell in love with her and disguised himself or metamorphosized himself into a white bull. We know white symbolizes the Caucasian, right? And the bull symbolizes Taurus in the zodiac sign, right? And he brought her to Crete. Crete is one of the islands of Europe, right? But she was a queen. She was a black queen. So your original Europeans in the mythology is telling you came from Egypt, Memphis, whose father was king, right, of Phoenicia. He came from Egypt. He was the son of Poseidon, who was the brother of Zeus. And we know Poseidon was the god of water, right? Said Agenor was born in Memphis, Egypt, to Poseidon and Libya. Where's Libya, right? Libya is also, right? Libya is the daughter of Epaphras, the king of Egypt. In both Greek and Roman mythology, she personifies the land of ancient Libya, which is in North Africa. Here we go again, Africa. So Agenor, who was the father of Europa, who fell in love with Zeus, he came from Egypt, which we know melanated people came from there. Memphis, that's a black melanated people. The indigenous people of Egypt, or what we call Kemet, was black. So Agenor had to be black. His daughter Europa had to be the black goddess that fell in love with Zeus, who metamorphosized himself into a white bull. We know that the white symbolizes Caucasian, and it also can symbolize pure. And the bull symbolizes the zodiac sign of Taurus, right? And he was the son of Poseidon, who was the brother of Zeus, who fell in love with Europa, right? And his mother name was Libya, who was the daughter of Epaphus. Epaphus was the serpent that came from Egypt, right? He was the king of Egypt. And in the mythology was the king of Egypt in both Greek and Roman mythology. She personified the mother of Libya, the mother of Europa, who was Libya. She personified the land of ancient Libya in North Africa. So here we go again. When we talk about the original Europeans were Africans, that's what they were. And the indigenous people of Europe was Africans. This is what we're talking about. Libya, the mother of Agenor, who was the grandmother of Europa, came from North Africa. This is where we get the country Libya, right? And it says, and was considered by the Greeks to be the origin of the name of what is now Libya, right? Let's go back now. Let's go back to Agenor. Agenor was born in Memphis, Egypt, where black people come from. He was the son of Poseidon, who was the brother of Zeus, who fell in love with Europa and took her away to Crete, which is one of the islands of Europe. So these were black people. And your Greeks and your Romans were originally black people, because Crete is one of the islands in Greece. Greece is in Europe. So the original Greeks came from Egypt and they settled in an island called Crete. And due to the mythology, Europa and Zeus, who was the gods of the gods, so that means that when they came together, they made godlike children. So those black Nubian people were godlike people. You understand? Agenor, her father, came from Egypt. His father was Poseidon, and his mother was Libya, who came from North Africa, which also where black people come from. North Africa is known as the Maghrebi. It's where the Moors came from. The Moors came from North Africa into Europe. And they built this advanced civilization and ruled for 800 years. They the ones that brought the Europeans out of their darkness. So here I'm connecting the dots for y'all, right? And it says Agenor was born in Memphis, Egypt, right? He was the son of Poseidon, the god of water, and he was also the king of Atlantis. So we can go back to Atlantis. The 10 kings of Atlantis was ruled by Poseidon, the god of the water, and Atlantis was what? On water, right? Which is where the Atlantic Ocean was at. So those Phoenicians came from Atlantis, right? And it says Agenor's mother was Libya, who came from North Africa, which is the Maghrebi, which is where your black Moors came from, who invaded Europe and ruled for 800 years, bringing Europe out of its darkness under the Islamic power and control. And it says, and he, Agenor, had 2 twin brothers named Belus. The latter remained in Egypt and reigned over there, while Agenor departed to Phoenicia. So he had 2 brothers. One was called Belus. Belus was from where? Egypt. So his brother ruled in Egypt, where we know melanated people came from, where they built the Great Pyramids from, right? And it says Agenor moved to Phoenicia. This is where you get your Phoenicians, who we know were seafaring people. And they had a seafaring culture, you understand? And they went around like pirates, conquering and dominating other areas, putting them under their power, right? And it says Agenor departed to Phoenicia and reigned there, right? It says, according to source, he had a son. It says, according to sources, he was the son of Belus and brother of Phineas, Phoenix, Egypt, Egypt, here we go again, and Danos. The traditions was followed by the Tzites, but the added not Omninus as one of the 6 brothers. So they say Belus was his brother, but in some myths he was his father, right? But let's see who Belus is, because we know the word Bel means sun, and who are the people of the sun? Melanated people, right? That's where you get your non-ether melanated people. It says Belus, Egyptian, right? The Greek mythology, Belos was the king of Egypt and the father of Egyptus and Danis, and usually the brother of Agenor, who was the father of Europa, who fell in love with Zeus, right? He disguised himself as a bull. They fell in love and he took her away to Crete, which is one of the islands of Greece, and we know that Greece is also in Europe. So they named the place Europe, coming from Europa. And she had to be black because her father was black, because he started in Egypt and then he departed into Phoenicia, right? So the original Europeans, they're telling you in the myth, was dark skinned, right? It says, now, but we're talking about Belus, who was his brother, right? It says Belus was the king of Egypt, the father of Egyptus and Danis, and usually the brother of Agenor. The wife of Belus had been named Achiro or Sidi, an eponine of the Phoenician city of Sidon. It says Belus was the son of Poseidon. Here we go again. So Belus was the brother of Agenor, who ruled Egypt, black people, right? The Great Pyramids, right? And then Agenor departed from Egypt and went to Phoenicia. And he had a daughter called Europa who fell in love with Zeus. So this black queen fell in love with Zeus, who were the gods of the gods. So they made a special type of bloodline, a divine bloodline. This is why when we talk about the black nobility of Europe, those elite Moors had the blood of the gods in them. They were gods in the flesh. The mythology is telling you that when you decipher it, right? Because Poseidon and Zeus were gods. It says Belus, the brother of Agenor, who was the son of Poseidon and son of Libya, which came from North Africa, right? He may also be called Bucerus, son of Libya, ruler of Egypt, killed by Hercules. Although Hercules was born many generations after Belus, since he was the great-grandchild of Perseus. You understand? So Bel or Belus came from Egypt. Bel is also known as Marduk in the Babylonian mythology. And we know Marduk was the sun god. And he also in Egypt was known as Ra. So Ra, Marduk, Belus, they all were symbols of the sun. So they were people of the sun. This is why they talk about the non-ether beings, black melanated beings, big nose, big lips, woolly hair. They came from Egypt, and we know that Egypt built a great civilization based on science and math, right? They built those great pyramids. And Agenor moved to Phoenicia, and he had his daughter, the Black Queen, moved to Crete with Zeus, who was the gods of the gods, and they started a bloodline in Europe, who was divine bloodline, a royal divine bloodline. You understand? So I hope y'all get it. So let's go back to the black conquistadors, those same elite Moors that came over here and they enslaved the indigenous people, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Iroquois, the Lenape, the Algonquin. You understand? These were the indigenous people of the lands here, way before these European settlers came over here. And they mesh culture with each other. Like I told you in the first lecture, that they mesh culture together. And eventually, these elite Moors robbed and steal from their own people. So these elite Moors that built the European Royal European nobility, they were your black gods. You understand? And they were your black conquistadors. So let me finish reading. It says the black conquistadors were men of African descent, both free and enslaved, who fought alongside the Spanish in the early conquest of America. So when the Spanish came over here to conquer America, where your indigenous people were at, which were your 5 civilized tribes, right? Who were your Cherokee, your Choctaw, and your Chickasaw, right? The Creek and the Seminoles, right? These black conquistadors came over here to conquer them, to take their land and their resource and put them under their European Anglo-Saxon power and religion that we call Christianity. See, what they ain't telling you that these people were black. They just started off that they were white. Later on, they assimilated themselves into white people, but they started off as black, melanated people. You understand? And they looked at just like the indigenous people of North America and South America and Central America. So this was a war amongst black people at first. So let's talk about the black conquistadors. The black conquistadors were the men of African descent, both free and enslaved, who fought alongside the Spanish in the early conquest of America. I'm going to say that again. In the early conquest of America from the late 15th century onward. Figures like Juan Guerrero, the first to plant wheat in Mexico, and Juan Valente, who built a captain in Chile, are notable examples who sought to improve their circumstances by risking their lives in combat and gaining freedom and social advancement. Their participation was instrumental in military campaign, but they often faced marginalized roles and racial discrimination within the colonial system. So we know that the Spanish conquered parts of America, and they brought these black conquistadors of African descent with them. You understand? These Spanish, Christian Spanish, right? Because the Christians were Spanish. That was their religion. These were your black nobility. They were Christian Spanish, but they were black, elite Moors. And they were paying for these black conquistadors of African descent to come over here with them and conquer the indigenous people, who were your Choctaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Muskogee, and your Seminoles, and other Native American tribes like your Iroquois and your Lenape. It says the figure like Juan Guerrero was dark-skinned. He was a black conquistador. Said he was the first to plant wheat in Mexico. And Juan Valente, who became a captain in Chile, are notable examples who sought to improve their circumstances by risking their lives in combat and gaining freedom or social advancement. Their participation was instrumental in the military campaign, but they often faced marginalized roles and racial discrimination within the colonial system. The reason that they faced discrimination because they were dark-skinned. But they told us in history that they were black. All right? And they came over here with the Spanish conquest, right, to take over America. So let me bring up something. Give me 1 minute. The question is, when did Spanish conquistadors go to America, right? It says the Spanish conquistadors began arriving in America in 1493. Remember, the Spanish Inquisition happened in 1492 with Queen Isabella and Ferdinand, right, of Spain. They were the king and queen of Spain, and they're the ones that gave Christopher Columbus, another black conquistador, money and power to come over here to America to take land and resources from the Native Americans, who were your black aboriginals of the land, right? It says the Spanish conquistadors began arriving in America in 1493, shortly after Christopher Columbus. Remember, his name wasn't Christopher Columbus. His original name, he was a Portuguese, and his original name was Hernando Zarco. Hernandez Zarco, right? And he was Portuguese, and he was a Sephardim Jew, a black Sephardim Jew. So what they told us about Christopher Columbus was a lie. Christopher Columbus was his Christian name because he converted over to Christianity. And he had to do that to save his life because they had something called the Spanish Inquisition that was set up by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain to chase the Jews and the Muslims out of Spain. So you either had to convert over to Christianity or die. So Christopher Columbus changed his name to Christopher Columbus, and Christopher Columbus means the Christ bearer. You understand? So it says Spanish conquistadors began arriving in America in 1493, shortly after Christopher Columbus' first voyage in 1492, which expeditions soon followed to conquer vast empires and secure resource for Spain. You hear that? It says vast empires. So they knew that these indigenous people of America had empires, vast empires. You understand? And secured resources. So they had vast empires and they had resources that the Spaniards and these black conquistadors, who mostly were your Jews or your Muslims that converted over to Christian European religion. You understand? Let's keep on going. It said notable, the conquistadors, including Hernán Cortés, who led the conquest of the Aztec Empire in the 1519 and 1521 period, and Francisco Pizarro, who led the expedition to conquer the Inca Empire starting in 1528. Francisco Pizarro was black. He was a black conquistador. And Hernandez Cortez was a black conquistador. Right? So let's go back to your black conquistadors, right? It says the key aspect of black conquistadors, the motivation for participation, freedom. Many enslaved black men fought to earn their own freedom. Advancement. Both free and enslaved individuals sought to improve their social standing and economic situation through military service. Right? Notable figures. Juan Garrido, a free man born in West Africa. You understand? So he was a black conquistador that was born in West Africa who joined the conquest of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Mexico, and was the first to plant wheat in New Spain. Juan Valente, an African-born former slave who became a captain in Chile and was eventually granted his own estate. Other figures like Juan Garcia Pizarro, Pedro Filipo, and Juan Bardel, and Antonio Perez, and Juan Portuguese. These were other black conquistadors, remember. And they came under the power of Spain, which Queen Isabella and Ferdinand, they were your black Christian nobility families. So when I talk about your black nobility coming out of Europe, we're talking about your Christian monarchs and your Muslim caliphates and your Jewish empires that came together through the banking system. These were all black conquistadors that came over here and robbed and stole from the Aboriginal or the Native Americans who also were black, right? So I hope y'all get that. That these people were black and that your Europeans were black. And I proved through the mythology, breaking down the codex of the mythology. We talked about Agenor, who came from Egypt, Memphis, Egypt. And we know that Egypt was black, melanated, right? And he had a brother called Belus, who also was the ruler of Egypt. And Agenor departed and he went to Phoenicia. So that means that the original Phoenicians came from out of Egypt, who was black melanated people. Those Phoenicians was black too. You understand? And Agenor had a daughter named Europa, where Europe come from. And she fell in love with Zeus, who was the gods of the gods. So when Europa and Zeus got together, they had a divine royal bloodline. You understand? So those black elite Moors had divine blood in them. They were the children of the gods, right? Based on Europa and Zeus, who was the god of the gods. And Europa being a queen coming from her father, King Agenor, who came from out of Egypt, who had a brother called Belus, right? Which symbolizes the sun. In Babylonia, he was known as Merduk. In Egypt, he was known as Ra, right? So we can see the divinely God, royal European bloodline coming together. And these same European bloodlines are your black conquistadors who have of African descent, who enslaved the indigenous people or the Native Americans of the Americas. And they came over here under the power and the behest of the Spaniards, who were your Christian monarchs, your black Christian monarchs. And they were the ones that conquered parts of America, right? Let's go back. Because I want to read that again, and then I'm going to fade out and I'm going to come back again. Because I don't want it to be too long. I'm going to read that one more time. Give me 1 minute. It's moving slow. This thing moving slow. So let me come back. When I come back, I'm going to read that again. So be right